Welcome to the Homelab Show, episode 69. We're going to talk about remote access. How you
Yep.
doing, Jay?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, good, good. We were, we started the show just a couple minutes late because we were still going over. There's so many good remote access tools out there, and some of the choices are confusing. So we're going to hopefully offer a few solutions out there and talk about some of the security around them. We want to make sure people think and are mindfully if they're going to be using this outside of their home lab. But this has been a fun topic. There's so many of them, and this may be even a topic we revisit to dive into any one specific one of these in the future, because boy,
Mhm.
the more I started digging into it, but there's just a lot of different ways to handle this. That's why we're hoping to bring it down a little to give you some choices, give you some ideas, and find some new tools to play with. But before we do
Yep.
that, we want to thank a sponsor of the show, and that is Lenode. And for some of these apps, you will want to host them in the cloud to give you and broker access between different machines. And Lenode is a great place to host that. They've been sponsoring the Home Lab show since the beginning. They've been a great sponsor of the show, and they're a great tool for home labbers to use to test out things, try their marketplace, get things spun up fast, do some project learning on someone else's servers where you may want to publicly expose things, but not publicly expose your own servers. And of course, some of
Mhm.
these remote access tools, this is going to be pretty relevant because you're going to want to host this somewhere else, especially one of them I'm going to mention to help provide remote support. Well, having that external is going to be kind of a cool place to have it, such as Lenode. So we have an offer code down in the description below to get you started with Lenode. We thank them for a sponsor show, and let's talk about remote access.
Yep. Let's talk about remote access. And to your point earlier, I mean, you weren't kidding when you said that there's a bunch of solutions. I just want to give the disclaimer: we cannot possibly cover or even mention all of them because there's just too many of them. So I know we're going to get a flood of comments about what about this, what about that. Trust me, we know. We've been looking around, and there's no shortage of
Yeah.
solutions.
The thing I want to preface all of this with, because some of these tools require you to open some ports if you want to manage things remotely. Obviously, within your home lab, no big deal. Just make sure the devices are on networks by which they have rules or on the same subnet that they can talk to each other. But once you start exposing these externally, you increase your threat surface. A lot of these tools we talk about here may or may not have gone through rigorous security review. I remember, and there's one of the tools that I'd seen someone mention. I forgot the name of it already. It's not in my list because the project maintainer got a job and they dropped it. And because of that, there's not been any updates for several years. So nobody knows. And people sometimes will conflate, well, no one's pointed out any security flaws in this product for a while. That just means probably no one found one, no one's looking, or maybe they did find one and no one reported it because there's not a proper package maintainer to let anybody know. This happens a lot
Right.
in different products. So just take that when you're thinking about any of these products. If you're going to deploy these, what is your threat risk that comes with it? Should you be running this all behind a VPN? That's generally my recommendation, especially for home lab people. And unless the company has a public facing, they tell you we're actively developed and we are actively going through regular security review and testing. Really just be cautious before you load some of these remote access tools on there. As I said,
Yep.
much less of a risk if you have it in your home lab, but I just want to get that out of the way so I don't have to mention it with each product.
Yeah, absolutely. Do your due diligence when it comes to vetting these. I mean, we are telling you what's out there. We did not do a code audit.
Yeah.
Just want to make that clear.
And I don't think neither me or Jay are qualified to do full application pen testing. So
No,
don't
I
ask us
that's
to.
that I'm good at many things, but that's not one of them. So
It is a special skill to be able to do that. It's a lot of
yeah,
work.
it is.
All right. What's the first protocol we should talk about or first software?
Well, I think the first thing we should talk about is just some best practice. And I hate the word best practice. I'm still looking for an alternative because there's no such thing as the best practice, because the
Mhm.
best practice means like you're unhackable, which isn't going to happen. But
Yeah.
um for example, don't make things publicly available just because you can and just because it's easy. If you have even if you use one of the things that we're about to mention via VPN or through a VPN tunnel, that's better. I
Yeah.
know that's another step, and some people just love having things remotely available. I would love that too if you could actually do that without it being a potential risk, and there's no way to do that without it being a potential risk. So make sure you're paying attention to capabilities for lateral movement if someone was to get into the machine. Make sure that it's only available via VPN or whatever your solution might be. Remote access it gives you remote access, and you really need to,
Yeah.
take advantage of the solutions. I think the best way to handle this is always to have just, multiple things in front of it. And sure, that's not really convenient, but I think it was Steve Gibson on Security Now that said, "Convenience is the enemy of security," and that's very
Yeah.
true.
It's very
So
true.
keep that in mind. So I think the best, analogy here for anybody that's seen the show Get Smart, which is one of my favorite shows of all time. I think it was like the '60s or early '70s. Awesome show. In every episode in the intro, Maxwell Smart is going through door after door after door, and there's vaults and then all these secret entries. That's exactly the analogy to use when you make something remotely available. You have to have some things in front of it to secure it because you
Yes.
want to make sure you're doing the right thing.
Absolutely. So the two common ports are going to be 22 for SSH and
Yep.
3889, sorry, for RDP. Please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, as I know people will. But
That's something about that doesn't I don't know. I don't know about that.
yeah,
Maybe I don't use it enough. It's either right and I don't use it enough or it's not right.
yeah, I don't use RDP very often either. Commercially, I'll get that out of the way if people are wondering. I've been using a tool called ConnectWise Control for my commercial business. So that is just to clarify that people always ask, well, do you use any of these in production, Tom? No, we use a commercially supported products. It offers us a lot of other convenience. All right, moving on to the fun products that you should use. Do you have a punch order list, or should I just start?
I don't, but I mean, one thing that I could just throw out there is X to go
I,
because,
that's the first
um
one on my tab that I had
really,
pulled up.
really? Okay. Because that one, it has some additional features that actually you were the one that, taught me about it actually. But let's back up a little bit. So X to go has been the best for me that I've used personally so far, and I'll, let you know why I say so far later on. But X2Go has a server component and also a client component, so you can, remote into whatever server as long as it's running the X2Go server and it's available from the client. And if I remember correctly, you still have to add a, repository for the server component, but I think the client is built in. It's been a little while because here's my problem. I'm always home, and especially, since the pandemic started, I kinda, was stuck in the office, and then I got used to it, I guess. I need to get out of the house more and test these things out because over 10 gig, I mean, everything's gonna work pretty fast over 10 gig here locally. But X2Go, it just works so well. And
Yes.
then there's that additional option where you can expose an application. So you don't have to show an entire desktop. You could actually just bring up Firefox and it'll look like it's a native app, but it's actually running from the X2Go server. Or you could expose the entire desktop and control it. And what I was doing before I switched editing softwares is I would have a server with a bunch of cores that would have SyncThing installed on it, and it would sync my video files and my Caden Live back when I was using it. It would sync its project files over there. So I'd edit the video on my desktop, and this is before I had a really good desktop. Then I would just, expose Caden Live, but it's running on that server. And since SyncThing has all the files in the project files, I just open up the project file, hit the render button, and it's rendering the video. And then since it's again sync thing, the final video will sync back to my computer and then I upload it. And I did that over X2Go by simply exposing Caden Live only. I didn't care about the whole desktop. So it's up to you if you want to see the entire desktop and have an application menu, or if you just want the application itself.
Yes, and I've done a few videos on Exaco getting started with it. The good news is it's built into most Linux distributions. You have to use, as far as I know, I don't think there's, well, maybe someone can hack it together, but for the most part, it expects a a Linux server or, your Linux desktop to be the
Mhm.
server that can either serve up the application, serve up the desktop. So as Jay said, you can use it. Actually, can find kind of a novel feature is you can even take a browser and publish that as an application, and then on the client side, you can use a Linux client or you can be your Windows computer. So either one of those
Yep.
work from the client side of X2Go. So the initiating the connection to those other devices, you're able to use that. Once again, it's a free download and there's the client side is really simple. It's just a little app that runs that, you point it towards X2Go. Now, one of the things nice is when you're using it Linux server and client, because it can use it's using SSH as its transport layer. So you don't have to worry about any extra layers of encryption or how they implemented the encryption at X2Go. It's transporting everything over SSH. So if you have a system that you've already got your SSH keys all configured and set up on, X2Go, the client can go, oh, okay, I can attach to devices to grab those applications and bring them over, or grab the desktop and bring it over, and the sound, and do that just via SSH key. So it does make it fairly simple. So if you've already taken the time to build out your SSH keys, added passwords to your SSH keys, as we've talked about before, you're relying on that level of authentication, and then you're there at the desktop. I've also showed this works reasonably well on a Raspberry Pi 4, so it's not super intensive. I've done an example of doing it with like Kali Linux. So let's say you wanted to have a Kali Linux system and you're doing some testing, but you want to have it on another network and you want to be able to get to the desktop, not just SSH into Kali. It's nice because you can use all the UI tools that way where the device is local, even on something as simple as a Raspberry Pi. So X2Go is definitely, for getting Linux desktops somewhere else, hands down, one of the best
Yep.
apps I've seen for doing it. It's easy to use, easy to set up. There are certain limitations, I think, and it easy enough to do. I commented this in my videos, tutorials I have on X2Go. You want to make sure you choose the desktop that works better for it.
Right.
The desktop, what's the desktop that Linux Mint uses?
Well, I was gonna say, an alternate, recommendation. Well, actually, the primary desktop is Cinnamon, but they also have a Mate version.
Cinnamon and Mate both work the best with it.
Oh, I didn't know about Cinnamon because I thought that Cinnamon required graphical capabilities. Mate is
Mate
lit
works really well. I thought
it
Cinnamon worked with
does.
it too, but I know Mate. Mate's hands down. I thought Cinnamon would work with it as well.
It
It's been a
might.
little bit since
Yeah,
I tested it with that. Pretty much, I just go with the Mate desktop because it transports well. That's one of the features you get is you can choose different desktop environments, and those desktop environments don't have to be the same as the one like when you're sitting directly at it. So your laptop can be
right.
using the desktop environment of your choice, but then you can also load in the background on different like Mate or even XFCE. The simpler the desktop environment is probably going to be better. And the
Yep.
reason for that is you just have less animations and graphics to bring over, so you have a better user experience doing it.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous recommending Cinnamon, although they could have fixed it, but since, there's a lot of it's not I'm not gonna say it's a heavy desktop environment, but it does heavily use the video card, whereas, Mate can, but they literally can detect. I mean, Mate itself is configured to detect if it's running in a remote desktop, and it'll be able to change its interface to match that. One example of this is, let's say you give access to your remote desktop to a family member or a colleague or something, and you don't want them to shut it down.
Right.
On a desktop, you have a shutdown button, but it'll literally change the shutdown button to a logout button
Yes.
instead because it knows it's in a remote desktop. And I think that's just so clever. So that's usually the reason why it's the first I recommend for this particular purpose.
Yeah. Um, so next one I want to bring up. Now I have not done extensive testing with it, but I gotta admit it's pretty slick and pretty basic to get set up. And that's going to be Rust Desk. And Rust Desk is more, and I like it now. It's become popular enough that if you type in like open source team viewer replacement, which of course that's what their title reads, it says a remote desktop software, the open source team viewer alternative, works out of the box, no configuration required, full control of your data, no concerns about security. You can use your public relay servers or self-hosting in your own cloud. So they've got a pretty lightweight, simple system. I have not gone through to see what level of security vetting and auditing it's done as far as like how they do the transport layers, but it's pretty slick. And if you're just using it even for some basic quick access to things, I think it's a kind of a neat option out there.
Yep.
The Rust Desk has been around for at least a little while, and it seems to have grown really popular very quickly. I think it's kind of that ease of use, simple deployment, decent documentation, and a pretty clean website. Like all the right factors. It wasn't like it takes you 10 hours of poking at it to try to get it set up. They even have Docker containers. They have a one-line installer to get it started. So they got some pretty easy ways to get going with it. And there's a YouTube channel called Awesome Open Source. As a matter of fact, to my knowledge, they're the only ones they've done 2 videos on Rust Desk. But those tutorials are longer and in depth of every little detail of setting it up and security and how to set up different keys with it. Cause there's a couple ways there's a couple ways you can implement the way the security works on there, but it seems a pretty complete application, and it supports both Linux and Windows either way for client or server. So you can get remote access to Windows computers, you can get access to Linux ones. I thought it was a pretty slick looking tool. I was impressed with it. I watched that awesome open source video. I didn't watch all of it in detail for those of you wondering in case there's some detail I overlooked, but definitely worth checking out. That video is pretty complete. It seems it's all broken down step by step of how to get it running.
Yeah, I wonder how much of the popularity is due to the fact that it has Rust in the name, considering how popular that is nowadays.
Yeah, maybe so. That could be it
Possibly.
too.
Awesome.
Um, yeah, that one was a pretty neat one right there. Now, one of the other ones is going to be, and I believe our friend Christian, what is his? I forgot his YouTube channel name. I'll pull it up in a second. I'll make sure it's in the link in the show notes. But he uses Teleport, and he uses it commercially for business. So, and Teleport's one of those pretty neat options for not just doing, and you heard that ding because I pulled up their website, because it's go to teleport.com is their new domain. I believe they had a different domain before when I first started looking at them as a product, but
It's
their goal,
actually goteleport.com.
go teleport. You're right. Go teleport.com. There we go. Now, don't be scared that it has pricing up there. They do offer this as an enterprise option with full SLA agreements, but the system itself is free and open source. And I actually like the fact that when you click on pricing, there's a download now option. Self-hosted, fully open source, GitHub SSO integration, and community support. I mean, community support kind of makes sense, what you're going to get on there. Now, Teleport is a bit more complicated to set up, but gives you a lot of flex ability on there.
It's Digital Life, by the way.
Digital Life. Yes,
Yep.
that Digital Life, right? I think is
The Digital Life.
the
Yep.
Digital Life. Yes. If you the Digital Life Teleport, he's got a couple tutorials on it. But one of the cool things about Teleport, the good and bad, it has an agent. That bothers me a little bit. But if you want that extended functionality that Teleport offers, I get how the agent really plays into this. It's not just for brokering connections for SSH. It is also for full audit logging of those connections. It is good for web applications, and having those essentially, it's like a reverse proxy. So you can set this up to all your different apps. And now you have, and you can set this up so you can access it remotely when you're not in your home lab too. They've done a good job of making it really easy to go through, set up things like your Grafana, your dashboards, your web logins for many different things. Then Teleport can go talk to each of those, provide essentially a reverse proxy for any of these. That reverse proxy then allows you to easily connect. And more importantly, especially from the business standpoint, and why he mentioned like commercial use of this, is it has full audit logging everything that was done. Now, this actually has a couple effects. One, it's really good if you're running a business to have full audit logging of people and what they did. What do you think about that, Jay? How important is logging when we're managing other Linux technicians? Would you love to know every command they typed and
I
how they got there?
I mean, logging is like everything. It's absolutely everything.
And this, one of the things this will do is have audit trails for all the commands they type. Now, especially for Homelab, people are like, well, I'm the one typing the command. Is that a big deal? Yes, because how many of you actually have a list of all the commands you type to get somewhere? Being able to replay some of that, I think, is just a really neat feature. And it's a good learning feature because when
Mhm.
you go through and set something up, you can watch yourself and all the iterations and all the things you typed on there. It also creates a nice central place to have all of your logins. So if you have a dozen machines that you're managing, some in a mixed environment, having that in there and log in and go, all right, I logged into this server here at this time. I logged into this server this time. Here's the commands I typed. That's just kind of a nice feature that they have for all of that. I think Teleport's a
Yeah.
pretty slick system, and being fully open source is awesome. And being supported by a business use case means I don't think someone's going to get another job and just drop the project. I like open source projects that, hey, here's all the code. By the way, we have a SLA agreements and full service and support you can get on this side of the house, which is actually really cool.
Yeah, I like that model as well. It is you could use it, or you could at your company also use it and get a support agreement. So everybody
Yeah,
wins.
yeah, everybody wins, and it's just kind of a neat tool to be able to have. I haven't dug into setting up the reverse proxy, but he has a video talking about that. So Christian's video on it. If you type in, like I said, Teleport and the Digital Life, he's got two good breakdown videos of it that go in depth on everything on there. So
Yep.
I
Yeah,
see.
so definitely a video to check out, and, he's actually a friend of ours, so,
Yeah.
shout out to him if he's actually listening.
Yeah. Now, have you used, because I'll bring it up, have you used Apache Guacamole, Jay?
I have, but it's been a very, very long time. If I remember correctly, it presents a remote or actually it presents a desktop in your browser.
Yeah, and it's so you can get Apache Guacamole is a clientless remote desktop gateway to support standard protocols like VNC, RDP, and SSH. They call it clientless because no plugins or software required. Thanks to HTML5, Guacamole is installed on a server. You need to access the desktop via web browser. So what it does is it brokers connections. It's kind of a go-between. So you're doing it within the browser. So now your Guacamole instance that you're accessing via your web browser, wherever you have this set up, hosted internally. And then on the back end of Guacamole, you're telling it to connect to all the other devices. Now, it's kind of slick how that works. I've not actually used it. The biggest thing with my use case comes down to a lot of times I just SSH into things. Now, I'm looking at honestly, even internally for us as we manage more Linux servers for clients. Well, the requests are coming in to do so. I might use something like Teleport because it's going to give me all the logging and key management and things like that. But
Mhm.
Guacamole seems like a pretty cool system. The fact that it supports RDP is pretty slick. And
It really
pivoting
is.
on a little bit of the RDP, when the latest GNOME now comes with RDP built in as well, doesn't it?
It does, and it's right there in settings, which was interesting to me because, I wasn't sure why, the GNOME desktop would have went that direction. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they shouldn't support it because I know it's a real thing, it's super popular, and, pretty much every company uses it. And there's it's one thing to support it and be able to connect to it, and also it kinda makes sense as we were talking earlier because, in a mixed environment, if you're using a Windows computer, it is pretty cool. You could use RDP to get a GNOME desktop. But what's interesting is GNOME does not work well at all in any way, shape, or form in a remote desktop. It's sluggish and barely even usable, in my opinion. I'm just going to be honest. So it
Yeah.
was really interesting to me that they went that direction. Maybe the remote desktop version isn't as bad as maybe other solutions. Like GNOME really isn't for that, in my opinion, but it is what it is. There's just one thing between supporting it or allowing to be connected by it, and I would think a open source solution would have been or fully open source and not reverse engineered solution would have been the forefront for them. But I found that to be interesting. But then, I also have to understand that, businesses are using it. It's super popular, so not supporting it, that wouldn't be a good idea either.
Yeah, and it's kind of neat because then with guacamole, with hopefully as it improves, it's been a while. Last time I tested any of the RDP, same thing. My experience with attaching it on Linux was not wonderful, but nonetheless, I mean, as that improves, you'll be able to use guacamole as a single point
Mhm.
internally to do it. Now, I have not dug into, and if anyone wants to leave a comment as to why it's called guacamole, so
Because guacamole is yummy. Why else would it be
I
called
mean, I
that?
like guacamole, so I don't have a problem with the name. I,
You
I
don't
like the
forget it, do you?
branding. Yeah,
You remember it.
yeah, I
Every
remember it.
time you go to a Mexican restaurant, it's like, "I need to try out guacamole when I get
You
home."
Yeah, it's how you help judge Mexican restaurants. You guys, it's the guac
Yep.
and the sauce, man.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely that.
So yeah, Apache Guacamole, it's supported by the Apache Foundation, so we know it's going to be around for a while. It seems to be quite well supported. Like anything, I really don't feel as though you should publicly expose this, but hey, it seems to be popular. Definitely among the comments on here. Maybe one day I'll give it a try. I believe Jeff from Craft and Computing has a video where he talks about using Apache Guacamole as well.
It might be a good solution too for, internal use when you're, at home and you're not accessing it remotely. Because one thought that I had is often when it comes to Homelab, the, spouse factor could be a factor, right? So,
Mm,
Plex server stops working and you're at work or something, so you can't really fix it. I mean, how easy would it be to have somebody who's not technical at all just tell them, "Go to this, bookmark that I put in your browser," and a desktop appears, double click on the icon that says "Restart Plex server," or whatever, I'm just making up the scenario, and maybe that might be a use case because then it would just be easy for them to get in and click that icon and restart the media server or whatever you happen to use. Because sometimes, unfortunately, our Homelab stuff, it just stops working. Like, I just discovered I had a issue with one of my 10 gig cards 2 days ago. And how long has it been since you switched me to 10 gig? Like a year, and all of a sudden it stops working. So sometimes these things happen, and maybe it makes sense just to have a desktop in the browser that someone at home can get to restart a service if they have to.
Yep. Next one on the list here. Now, this is pretty slick. And rport.io, rport.io, all these, like I said, will be linked in there. But that one is pretty slick because it is more than just remote access. It is a self-hosted open source remote management solution for Windows and Linux, intuitive, easy to use management for remote access, script execution, VPN replacement, and much more. Now, it's really impressive what you can do with this. We got support for SSH, remote desktop, VNC. Sorry, but Telnet's in there.
Boy.
Web-based user interfaces, and you can even do TCP-based protocols like SMB, network printing, and HTTP APIs and web servers. Now, to go a step further, one of the other things you can do with this, once again, you're loading agents to make all this work, but the agents will monitor Windows and monitor Linux systems. This is really slick because now you can get like a constant heartbeat, execute commands, build tunnels between them for connectivity. It's a pretty neat tool to consolidate all your servers again, very similar to the way Teleport handles it into a spot to do it. I think this is really slick because you can also execute commands, see uptime for them, see the monitoring back and forth. It reminds me in similar ways to what we refer to in the IT MSP services space, the RMM tool, remote management monitoring tool that you get commercially. This has got a lot of features. Now, it's not as full features as some of the paid commercial tools, but being that it's open source and self-hostable, if you wanted to manage a lot of different servers on your lab, this seems like a nice integration to be able to, once again, have one spot where you can essentially log in everything, one web interface. And both of these, in back to Teleport and this, have strong authentication methods where they all have 2FA. So even if you're using internally, because anytime you create a choke point where you're bringing everything down to one system to access it, that choke point is obviously something you should protect dearly because
Oh, yeah.
it is the key to all the kingdoms. And I've seen people who will use the argument against these tools going, well, you're centralizing all the control to one place. Well, you kind of need to do it. So you only have one place to replace versus decentralized in the control where, well, I've all dispersed and it's hard to tell who logged into what when because I'm pulling logs and consolidating them all together and then trying to figure it out. So it's not a bad thing to necessarily put all these in there into one place, but it's important that anything that you do that with does have all of these different two factors on there. So
Yep.
this does support though. I thought this was all data stored encrypted disks, connect up to 500 devices and unlimited current concession. I wasn't sure exactly because I didn't see any commercial option. I don't know if the 500 was a limit or exactly how
Hmm.
that worked on there. I thought it was strange. I mean, I mean, you may have more than 500 things in your home lab on there, but I thought it was strange why they
I'm
chose
kinda
500.
close.
Yeah. Maybe just part of the marketing. It says up to 500. Well, what happens if I have 501?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's just so many solutions out there, and I can't believe that I forgot to mention Ramina earlier. Um,
Yes.
and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right. That's just how I've been saying it. It's REMMINA, and it's an app. It's not in itself going to allow you to be, your systems to be accessed remotely, but what I think is great about it is that you could put your SSH connections in there, your remote desktop connections in one app, and then just have, one place to get to all those things. And I think it's a really awesome thing to have in general when you're actually, accessing things remotely, even if remotely is that, it's in the other room and you don't really want to go across the hall and into another room and, attach a monitor. But you could actually have all those connections in one, and it's available in, I don't think there's a single distribution of Linux that I haven't seen it for. I don't know if it works outside of Linux, but if you're working with Linux on your laptop or desktop, then it's, quick mention. Just wanted to mention that it's not going to allow people to access your systems, but it allows you to access the things you already have access to.
Yeah, there's another one someone mentioned in here, and I didn't know about it till earlier today when I was just doing a couple extra notes. It was early in the beginning of the show. Someone mentioned it.
Well, while
It's
you're looking for that, I'll just mention one more. I'm actually in the process of evaluating ThinLink right now, ThinLinc. And I don't have like a final opinion yet because basically, full disclosure, the company reached out to me to sponsor my channel. And, I get a ton of sponsorship requests. I probably accept maybe like 1 out of 30 or something. So I looked at this like I do anything else, just assuming it's BS until I yeah, actually get proven otherwise. And as I'm going through it, it's impressing me more and more because at first I'm like, well, does it support Linux? I get so many sponsorship requests where the product is not installable on Linux. And then I'll respond back like, you did look at the name of my channel before you sent this
yeah,
over to me, right? Which is always funny to me. Like it's number one requirement. If it doesn't work on Linux, like my audience doesn't want it. So
right.
anyway, so I look at it and then they have it available on FlatHub, the
Oh,
client.
okay.
I'm like, oh, I'm like, okay, well, I think that might mean that they get Linux. And then I keep looking through it, and it just really impressed me so far. And I was just Googling around trying to see what the general consensus was. People seem to enjoy it. Then I had a chance to test it out while I was on vacation. I set up a computer here just to be accessed, basically a crap installation I didn't care about, just to test it out. It worked fine. I had no problems at all. So the only thing that I would say that I don't like so far is that it doesn't support Raspberry Pi as the device you're connecting to. My understanding, and I'm still looking into this, is that the client can be installed on a Raspberry Pi, but serving a Raspberry Pi desktop itself is not supported yet. But I saw a bug report on their GitHub page for it, so apparently they're aware of that. And the reason why that bit me is because I set up a Raspberry Pi remote desktop to try this out on, and yeah, it didn't work for that, but it did work in all other cases. So I just wanted to throw out a mention, and I have a little bit more to go. And if they pass all of my rigorous testing, then they'll be a sponsor. But so I guess if you see a sponsorship, I think there's like usually like a month delay in my content. So if you see like a month and a half from now, then that means it got approved. If not, then it didn't. So
Yep.
I'm gonna throw that out there.
Now, when Jay brought up the remote desktop, that's for
Hakuna
Linux.
Matata.
Yeah, Komodo. I'm not sure. I know how to spell it, and I have to go to more conferences to figure out the common lingual way to say things. That's actually true for all Linux things. Linux
Mhm.
conferences teach us how to say things because when we just read them online, it's not the same. Um, but it supports RDP, VNC, SSH, so which is great. But the other one, if you're running Windows, and this is not anything more than just a connection manager, so it's not necessarily a remote access tool, but it's a way to manage all your connections in one app, and that's mremote ng. So the website is mremoteng.org, and it is just basically a multi-remote manager that supports RDP, VNC, SSH, Telnet, and our login, raw socket connections, and PowerShell remoting. So this
Wow.
is kind of a cool, yeah.
Our login and Telnet is just like the who's who of expired connection types. You
Yeah,
know, that's so hilarious. I mean, it's good that I guess for the people that are using it, but then why are people using it? But you know what? I'm sure they mean well, and it's a lot of different
there's
things you can connect to
well,
there.
there's a lot of people, and if your task is an internal sysadmin and you have been provided a Windows desktop by which you are going to be working from, that is just the case in some
Yep.
places. This is a tool that will help you manage all those other devices. So you're loading it on Windows to be able to manage everything else. So I know, as much as me and Jay are Linux on the desktop for many years, I know not all of you are there, or maybe the work conditions you are subjected to, which I don't know, is this cruel and unusual punishment, forcing people to use Windows at work? I don't know. This
I think it is because here's
it is
the
me and Jay.
analogy. Well, here's the analogy I use, right? So let's just say, for example, I randomly buy an auto mechanic facility. There's a bunch of mechanics working there that fix cars. And as the new owner, I go on there to, to the location, and then I say, okay, starting tomorrow, you guys are all using this particular brand of tools. I'd be laughed right off the shop floor. They wouldn't tolerate that for a minute.
Yeah.
So that's why I feel like we shouldn't either, because if something requires a particular operating system, then why use it? Everything else is cross-platform. I can get on a rant about that, but I'll probably stop. But unfortunately, if you do have to deal with that, I'm sorry if you are forced to use something you'd rather not use. But then again, lights at the end of the tunnel, because I'm sure that's, not going to happen for too much longer the way things are going.
Yes. So that was the other one that's kind of the counterpart to that. Someone had said in the comments here, and it's not something I validated, but if you store keys, they're potentially available if you're on a shared computer, stored temporarily in memory. So yeah, that's something to consider with any of these on there. So yeah, that's saving passwords in any of these. Use at your own risk. Make sure that they're vetted
Yep.
well, things like that. Probably the last one I have mentioned for here, and I knew people would ask about it, and I haven't used it, but I've oddly seen people building this in and saying they use it commercially, which I'm not personally comfortable with. But it's Mesh Central. It's become popular. It's been around for a little while. I believe it was started by some internal IT people, but nonetheless, it's another remote access tool that gives you nice central management to be able to remote into systems. It was built more alike to the tool I mentioned that we use, which is the ConnectWise Control / Screen Connect tool, commercial tool. It seems to be following along those design patterns, but it is not a commercial product. It is it open? It's under I
Hmm.
believe, BSD license. It says on here under the downloads. So yeah, interesting. It's built on top of Node JS, if I'm not mistaken, on there. But it looks pretty slick. I know a lot of people speak fondly of it. So it's another one to throw in your tool chest there for remote access, though. But it's not one
Yep.
I've particularly used. I've seen a lot of people. It comes up a lot of discussions in the business world where, like I said, a shocking number of people have told me that they're using it commercially, and I'm like, well, cool.
Yep.
um, I don't know. Well,
There,
someone
there's.
they're
I'm sorry.
using someone's commented here that they're using it's free by Intel. They're using some of Intel's technology, but I'm not clear how they wrap the security all around it. And clicking around their site didn't really tell me much in terms of any security details. But as I said at the beginning, that's not something we're here to really vet. That's something kind of you need to really think about before deploying any of these tools.
Absolutely. You have to, we use the technology, we don't develop it. So
Right.
if we developed it, we would know everything about the ins and outs of how every single instruction goes through the CPU. But yeah, just look at it and make a decision for yourself if it fits your use case, one, and two, don't deploy it until you know that they're taking security very seriously.
Yeah. Now, I will admit, one, it's very actively developed, and two, and a common friend of me and Jay, uh, Mesh Mesh Central does have a CrowdSec bouncer integration. So if you have it public facing, there is the ability to integrate a CrowdSec bouncer for it. So
Yep.
that's any of these actually, if you're doing public facing things, having CrowdSec bouncer on public firewalls is great. I believe we've done an episode of Homelab. We talked about CrowdSec, but individually, me and Jay
Yeah.
have our own videos on the CrowdSec topic. We still highly support that project. Really like it. It's and where it's going.
Yeah, yeah. When in doubt, just recall my Get Smart analogy, because each one of those doors that Maxwell
Mhm.
Smart walks through is basically an equivalent to some kind of protection that you have in front of your valued thing, and that's just the way to do it.
Yep. So I did see that in their announcement list. I'm like, anything you can do to help bolster your firewall and known bad actors not have them coming through. That's a good thing.
Absolutely.
All right, and that's the end of my list for some remote tools. There's a like I said, there's obviously a ton more out there. Those are just the ones I've taken the time to look at. Some of them I've
Hmm.
experimented, set up a little bit. Obviously, actually go I've done videos on, and you can find some good videos on both Rport. Awesome open source has a good Rport and Rust test video. Our friend Christian with that The Digital Life has a good video on Teleport. Actually, more than one of them to break down some of the more intricate use cases for it.
Hmm.
Oh,
Yeah.
you know what? Honorable mention, Putty for SSH. I don't even think we
Oh
need to
boy.
mention that one. Putty's been around since the 90s, I believe. Probably the first time I
Yeah.
encountered it. So Putty's been around forever. So we'll throw it out there. Putty's more of just a tool to use for the connections. But with Windows subsystem for Linux and you being able to put SSH keys in there, that's even with my internal text, I've been pushing them towards that. Just use SSH, load Windows subsystem for Linux, and put it in there. You're just using normal SSH at that time without having to do it. I mean, it's not
Right.
that hard to use
It's
keys and
not,
Putty, but there's
yeah.
some trickiness to it versus the videos that me and Jay have done on SSH key management work pretty much identical when you're doing Windows subsystem for Linux because it's just Linux inside of Windows.
I completely agree. I mean, Putty has at least existed for my entire career. I know that for sure.
Yeah.
It's one of, if not the first I've ever used. But, my personal opinion, I really don't like Putty at all. And the reason is because they decide to have their own system for managing SSH keys, and there's
Yeah.
never a reason to do that. There's no good reason for that. And I was hoping they would give up on that, but I think they're shooting themselves in the foot at the end of the day because, like you said, we have, WSL. You can get an actual Linux shell with actual SSH, not that Putty isn't actual SSH because it's
Right.
using the same protocol, but they just wrap so many unnecessary things around it. Now, it used to be the case that it was the best solution for Windows,
Oh, yeah.
and it has been for so long. And I also remember Cygwin being used around the same time to get some GNU apps running on your Windows desktop. But now that we have WSL, I feel like if you're a Windows user and that's your platform for your computer, then WSL is probably just the way to go.
No, January 8th of 1999, 23 years ago was initial release. I thought I used it when I remember using it in a sysadmin job, but oddly back then I was using it to telnet into different things for
Yep.
administration. Because telnet was really common back in when I started my tech career in 1995. So
Oh, yeah, so that means it's like 2 or 3 years older than my career in Linux, I think, because I think it was around 2002-ish where I started.
yeah. So it's been around a while. So I
It
think
really has.
hopefully everybody knows about it. So
I think they do, and it's, I feel like it's great that Windows has a, terminal built in
oh yeah.
because every operating system has had that for countless years, and Windows was the one that didn't. I mean, it had PowerShell, command prompt, sure, but an actual terminal, now they have their Windows terminal is just light years ahead of whatever they've had before.
Mhm.
And, even though I'm not a Windows person myself, I'll still give them credit where it's due. I think they did a good job developing that. It's certainly a lot better than a lot of the other solutions. But then again, I feel like we Linux users get the short end of the stick on most things, but Windows got the short end of the stick for longer when it comes to terminal tools because they're pushing PowerShell, which is still a thing. Don't get me wrong, but now that's built into the Windows terminal as well. So you can literally switch your shell right there in the app. So yeah, if you are using Windows, then WSL probably is the best SSH client that you can possibly get.
Yeah. Actually, someone's gonna bring this up. So now we're gonna be slightly off topic, but I think it's worth bringing it up.
Mhm.
Um, was it called Hyperterminal? Yes, Hillgrave Technologies Hyperterminal. That was one of the original terminal stuff that used back in the early days of Windows. Now,
Wow.
fun fact: Hillgrave is still over because I found their website, and they still list the same address. They're over in Monroe, Michigan,
Oh,
and
wow.
yeah, they're actually right by us. And they sold they that was one of their what brought them into success was selling Hyperterminal to Microsoft. And I always thought it was
Hmm.
cool forever ago because I'm like, hey, these people are local because I've always lived in a greater Detroit area. So they're all of about half an hour from my house.
Now that you mention it, I might have used that actually when I was in college and, learning Unix for the first time. I'm not sure why that's something about that stands in memory. I think I
Well,
might
it
have
was
used it
pretty much
actually.
like if you had a Windows computer, use Hyperterminal, that's how you would connect. Frequently is popular for connecting to BBSs as well because it had the dialer stuff built in.
Hmm. Yeah, I
So
think I might have used it. I would probably just need to
we all
search
did.
for a
It was a
screenshot, and
rite
then
of
I'll probably,
passage.
"Oh, yeah, that one."
It
Yeah.
was a rite of passage in our tech history. If you're in the 90s and you use Windows computers, I think it started in Windows 3.1. I think we had it first. I know it was in Windows 95, but I think it was also in there. Someone can correct me on that one. I'm trying to remember when it started. It's a little fuzzy remembering all that back. So
It really is. Like, I like the only thing that stands to memory for me is I haven't changed a bit because when I was studying Unix for the first time before I even learned Linux, and then I figured out how to change the terminal colors and customize it, I was just showing everybody in the room, "Look what I did to my terminal. It's green on blue instead of, fun times." Yeah,
Yep,
and
for
probably
sure.
around the same time period, I might have been using hyperterminal. So, yeah.
Windows XP
Now,
actually.
wouldn't it be 3.11 because wasn't Windows 3.11 the one that added networking to 3.1? Just curious. I don't know
Yeah,
if
the
that
3.11 was the one that got networking on there.
I don't know how far in that went, like, if there's some trace of networking that hyperterminal could connect to, or
Wi
if you literally had to be 3.11.
Windows 95 is where it started, so,
Oh, okay, so it isn't even a factor then.
yep, yeah.
Hmm,
So someone said 3.1 had it. Windows 95 definitely had it. So all right, now we're off topic, and we talked about some old history.
yep,
Links will be in the description for all the different tools we talked about. I don't know which one's the right one for you, but hey, you got some more learning to do, and we're happy to help you along on that journey. Thanks for joining us, and looking forward
yep.
to next episode.
See you later.
All right, thanks.